He was, by all accounts, an ordinary, nice, sensible young lad of 18 growing up, ready to make his way in the world. Chris had been working at the shop at Tolworth, and his brother and a friend had met him there, and they were just walking home in high spirits. They were singing and talking to each other. They weren't drunk, and they were just walking home together.
And then for some reason, nobody knows exactly what, an incident sparks where a group attack them.
When I opened the door, instead of Chris and Phil, there's two policemen. Chris has been involved in a fight. He's seriously injured. We need to get you to Epsom Hospital straight away.
I remember thinking, this is not happening to us. It's somebody else. They've got the wrong one. It's not Chris.
What we needed to do was identify who was responsible.
It was a crime of almost breathtaking callousness.
The man who tried to kill her will never be free to harm
The audio
again.
was too graphic to be
May
broadcast.
provide some closure for the victims' families, targeted young women unable to defend themselves.
Colin Sutton was a Detective Chief Inspector and Senior Investigating Officer in the Metropolitan Police. He led the investigations into some of the most complex and high-profile cases ever, bringing dangerous criminals to justice.
He showed his character.
Then heard screaming. The Night Stalker pulls out the gun.
Another 146 victims.
In this series, he will take you inside those cases and show you how he caught these criminals using nothing but pure detective work. This is The Real Manhunter.
Now been found guilty on all 29 of those charges. The oldest victim, 89.
The officer in charge described it as a senseless
The life
tragedy.
sentence may provide some closure for his victims' families.
I found out about the case the morning after it happened. It was a weekend in May, and I actually had the following week booked off for leave, and I was meant to be going on holiday for a week, but, needs must, and they didn't have anybody else who could run the investigation. I was asked by the Assistant Chief Constable to be the SIO for this murder, and he told me that an 18-year-old lad had been murdered on the Ewell bypass the previous night, and that at first the incident room was at Epsom Police Station, so can I go along there and meet the people who were going to be my team? And of course in Surrey at that time there wasn't a permanent murder squad, if you like.
My name is Jack Regan. I was a Detective Sergeant with Surrey Police. First met Colin Sutton as a result of this investigation. Colin had recently transferred from West Yorkshire to Surrey Police.
What happened was that you were appointed SIO, and then you were given sufficient staff that were kind of selected from the various divisions. So I didn't know, and I hadn't been there very long anyway, so I didn't really know anybody.
On the Saturday, I was up in the northeast on a family do. I was contacted and asked if I would travel back and assist to manage the investigation into his murder.
I turned up at Epsom and found that the acting DI, the DS who was going to be my number two, and it was a fellow called Jack Regan, and I'd never met him before, but he was one of these people that I just instantly took to, really, and he was a very different sort of character to me, probably a bit more sort of sparky and a bit more sort of expressive.
Then obviously on Sunday morning I met with Colin and I was updated on the investigation, what had happened up to that point, and then from then on I was Colin's deputy, running the day-to-day management of the investigation for him. This was the first occasion that I'd met and worked with Colin, and to be honest, I found him very open to ideas, to new ideas, to suggestions both from myself and from other members of the team that were working on this investigation.
I think it was one of those situations where we had two people whose qualities kind of complemented each other, and together we made quite a good team, and it was great working with him.
Chris Donovan was a 18-year-old lad, unknown to the system. The police didn't have no knowledge of him previously.
Chris came from a family that were, his mother and father, Ray and Vi, were committed Christians and regular churchgoers, and they had a daughter as well as the two boys, and it was quite a close family.
There was something about Chris that was special. He was, out of the 4 children we had, there was something different about him right from the start. And he was very loving, very kind to people, very loyal to his friends.
Christopher had been a model son, really, and he had this ambition after he'd sort of got a little bit older that he thought he was going to join the police force. He was interested in being a policeman.
He wanted to join the army. I took him to Blackheath barracks. He signed all the papers, but then they found he had terrible asthma. In fact, they advised him to join the police, would you believe? They said, join the police, do a few years in the police, when your asthma goes, we'll take you on. And he was looking forward to that. He was really thinking about joining the police.
He was, by all accounts, an ordinary, nice, sensible young lad of 18 growing up, ready to make his way in the world.
Sometimes murder is like a lottery, and there's a chain of circumstances which each individual circumstance by themselves won't particularly lead to any damage or harm. But when they all add up, and those millions to one, those coincidence, chance, they can result in the most horrific events which destroy lives and destroy the lives of those who love the victims.
The night of the murder was one of those situations when you reflect on it and you think, this was so senseless. At that stage, he was working for a pizza company, had been delivering pizzas, was managing a shop, and to all intents and purposes, he was a genuine nice guy.
He was a hard worker as well. He'd work 14 hours a day. He worked for a local pizza company. And one day he went in and found there was a record for the most deliveries in the day. He went, I'm going to break that. And he broke it.
Chris had been working at the shop at Tolworth, and his brother and a friend had met him there, and they were just walking home in high spirits. They were singing and talking to each other. They weren't drunk, and they were just walking home together.
I asked him what happened, Philip, and he said, we're walking along singing songs. 2 boys stopped us and told us we're singing the song wrong. We had a laugh and a joke, he said, and they walked on, we walked on.
And then for some reason, nobody knows exactly why, an incident sparks where a group attack them.
And there's a hill. Coming the opposite way of this hill are 14 boys and girls. And they were drunk and everything else. And they opened up, he said, to let us through. Phil walked through first, and the youngest one, wanted to get respect from his friends, punched him so hard in the face his nose ended up in his cheek.
This murder really was all about 2 groups of young people. You had one group which came from a party above the shops in this parade here. They crossed the road and started to walk down that side of the road. The other group, which included Chris Donovan, his brother and their friend, was walking down the road this way. And it was when they were just about on that hill going up the road there that they met. And as they met, there was some sort of argument. And some sort of argument broke out. It might have been about singing the words to a song wrong, something as simple as that. But of course, what you had is the group that had come from the party had all been taking drugs, had been taking amphetamine, they'd been drinking.
Sadly, events intervened in the form of this gang of hooligans, really, thugs who were looking for trouble. There was no reason to do what they did.
Whether there was a remark made, but it resulted what appears to be an assault on Chris and the other 2. Chris obviously tried to defend himself. He was knocked to the ground, and the witnesses described seeing him lying on the ground being kicked in a fetal position in the road on the Yule bypass.
And you've got this fight going on. It's midnight-ish on a Friday night, and it goes on for so long that people in the houses hear it and they come to their bedroom windows and they're looking out. That was very helpful for us as the investigation went on. And all they see is this group of young people milling about, fighting each other. And during that fight, Chris Donovan gets knocked unconscious. He falls to the ground, and while he's on the ground, somebody kicks him in the head, hard.
At that stage, it would appear that the traffic lights that were approximately 200 yards down the road were red, so there was no traffic travelling. They obviously changed, went through the phase to green, and then vehicles moved up the road. The group dispersed that had attacked them, leaving Christopher unable to defend himself and in the road. And sadly, he was then struck by a passing vehicle.
He's unconscious on the roadway, and there's a poor woman at these traffic lights. She pulls away. She drives up that hill, and she sees what she thinks is a bin bag or a bundle of rags in the road. And because there's another vehicle close to her, she tries to straddle it with her wheels. And she drives over it, and it's Chris Donovan. And part of his clothing gets caught on parts of the car, and she drags him along the road for 70 or 80 feet before she realises and stops. And of course that's caused him terrible injuries in addition to the injuries he suffered from the assault.
The impact on that, on the female driver, was huge.
"21 in the morning, our doorbell rings, and I'm thinking, how can two boys forget their door keys? When I opened the door, I was going to give my right mouthful. You can imagine, get me out of bed. When I opened the door, instead of Chris and Phil, there's two policemen. That was when Chris and Phil's dad. I said, yes. I said, we need to speak to your wife urgently. So what's it about? They wouldn't tell us. Until I got out of bed, they said that Chris has been involved in a fight. He's seriously injured. We need to get you to Epsom Hospital straight away.
I remember thinking, this is not happening to us. It's somebody else. They've got the wrong one. It's not Chris.
We did 13 miles from the hospital. When we got there, Philip and his friend Richard were in forensic clothing. Philip's face is all blooded. As I'm talking to Phil, another policeman came up and said, you can't see Chris, they're operating him.
And we just sat in that room with Philip holding him, and he was crying and shivering and shaking, and it was like your whole world's just crushed in around you.
Then 20 to 4 in the morning, when you see the doctors, the police, and the hospital chaplain, they didn't have to tell us, their face told us. Christopher died that morning because one 15-year-old coward wanted respect from his friends.
I ran out the door and I ran down the corridor. I can remember a huge policeman coming towards me, holding his arms out, and he hugged me. And he looked down at me and he said, we're going to get them. And I remember thinking, no, you're not.
We all felt that we needed to do the best job that we could for Chris, his family, his parents, Ray and Vi, who had obviously suffered immensely as a result of what had happened.
Chris became what is known as a property of the coroner. He's not a crime scene, he's our son. But we couldn't touch him. And I remember the policeman saying, I don't know how to ask you this, is this your son? And I know a lot of young people disrespect the police. But that man hugged me like a father that night and cuddled me and cared for me. There is a human being behind that uniform that we had to show people that the police are not animals. I got the utmost respect for them from that day on. 2 hours later, in walked another policeman. His name's Colin Sutton. As he walked in the room, the atmosphere changed. I know it's hard to believe, the atmosphere changed. And he just sat down on the chair, with Nelson sit down, where he just sat down, looked me in the eyes, didn't call me Mr. Donovan. He went, Ray, I would never lie to you. And the minute he said that, he got my respect. He then said, I put up an accident sign. I said, why did you put up accident when it's murder? He said, if I put up murder, no one will come forward, trust me. And from that day to this, I trust that man. And so do you, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. Something about him, his personality, his caring, permeates in a room when he walks in, and it was the only thing that we had that was strong. We all felt so out of control at that time. Everything was taken away, and everything you know and hold dear is gone. But this one person comes in and they're strong, and that's so amazing.
Being able to talk to Chris's brother and friend, what became clear was that these two groups didn't know each other. There was nothing pre-arranged, there was no history between the groups. It was just something that happened on the spur of the moment as they bumped into each other on the street.
As soon as I was updated on what had happened and the descriptions that had been given by various members of the public who'd looked out of their mainly bedroom windows because it was late at night to see what was happening, it was clear that we had a group of assailants, some of whom were responsible for the assault on Chris, others who were merely standing by.
The fight happened, and the place where it happened was bordered on both sides of the road. It's a dual carriageway, but there were houses on both sides of the road. And because the fight went on for some minutes and there was shouting and noises, quite a few of the local residents were alerted by it.
What we needed to do was identify who was responsible.
Quite unusually, I suppose, we had a number of eyewitnesses, people who could tell us exactly what was happening and what they'd seen and who was doing what. And that was to become, very, very helpful for us as the investigation went on. Another witness that we had was a very unfortunate lady who'd been driving a car. And she was driving her BMW from Epsom towards Tolworth, and she left the traffic lights close to where the murder happened. And by this time, Chris Donovan was unconscious and lying in the roadway. And this lady didn't realise it was a person. She thought it was a bin bag or some rags or something. And because there was another vehicle to her outside, she decided that she would just sort of straddle it with her wheels and drove over it. And of course, this had inflicted horrible injuries on him. And this poor woman was absolutely distraught. And it completely wasn't her fault. It could have happened to anybody. But that was another factor that we had when we had this lady who we were treating as a witness, of course, rather than any sort of suspect. It's a really unusual incident for that part of the world. It's not, you don't get murders in Ewell, really. And people in the community wanted to help. And it didn't take very long for people from the Water's Edge estate to be phoning in and giving us the names of the youths that were in this sort of assailant gang. And we had a range of youths from 15 years old up to early 20s. It was one of those situations where the names were repeated. Different people phoning in had given us the same names. And so we were confronted with the fact that the overnight team had gone out and arrested them.
We had some people who'd been arrested on that Saturday morning as a result of information coming into the police. But what we didn't have was clear descriptions of the clothing that the offenders were wearing. And without having that clothing, it would be virtually impossible to prove who was responsible for the assaults on Chris. We had varying descriptions of tops, trouser bottoms, we had baseball caps, and we had descriptions of at least one of them kicking Christopher as if he was taking a penalty whilst he was on the ground.
We had all these people there. We could interview them and try and get an account from them if they so desired, and if they were going to talk to us. But ultimately, they were going to have to be released on bail, and we were going to have to carry on the investigation until we found proper evidence that would justify their arrest again.
One of the difficulties as a result of Chris being struck by the vehicle was that it was important to identify to the court what killed Chris. Was it the actions of the people who assaulted him, or was it as a result of being struck by the motor vehicle? As a result, it meant that, unfortunately, further inquiries and research had to be made into Chris's brain to ascertain the seriousness and of the injury inflicted.
While we're outside, the coroner went, "I've got bad news." I said, "What could be worse than that?" She said, "Because of the kicking in the car, I had to prove what killed Chris. To do that, I had to remove his brain, wait for an enzyme to come out. This takes 16 weeks, and you can't bury Chris for 16 weeks.
The injuries that Christopher had suffered were quite extensive. And the pathologist was a guy called Ashley Fagan Earl. He was very helpful in the sense that he was quite categorical about what he said, because he looked and examined every inch of Christopher's body, and he was able to say quite definitely that the injuries he'd suffered from the neck upwards were from an assault, the injuries from the neck downwards were the abrasion injuries from being dragged under the car. And crucially, he said, it's these ones, the assault injuries, that killed him.
This therefore put the whole case on a murder footing.
One of the things that came out at the post-mortem was that Chris had quite short hair anyway, and they shaved the head so that we can see more clearly any injuries. And on the top of his scalp, there was quite a well-defined pattern of bruising. And it looked for the world as if it were a print from the sole of a training shoe or some sort of ridged sole from footwear. So it looked like somebody had stamped on his head. And we were a little bit kind of confused by this because, if you imagine, because it was right on top of his head, the circumstances in where somebody could get to that position to stamp on his head would be a bit difficult to envisage. You know, if he was climbing out of a manhole, then you could do it. But in the fight that's gone on, we weren't quite sure how that could have happened.
A lattice type of shape, or a shape, had been identified, which the police initially thought, on scientific advice, forensic advice, was from the sole of a training shoe.
And when we got the clothing and training shoes from all the people that had been arrested and started looking at them, there wasn't a pair of shoes or a pair of trainers that, just by observing it, looking at it, matched this mark on Chris's head.
They arrested 6 suspects very shortly after Christopher's murder, and they took, obviously, their clothing, shoes were of the most paramount importance, but none seemingly matched the imprint on Christopher's head from the fatal injury.
It troubled me for a few days because I thought, well, it's obviously that mark, that bruising, is obviously something to do with the assault, but it doesn't look like we thought a stamp. And what I did was I went back with Jack Regan 2 or 3 days after the post-mortem back to the mortuary and asked the mortuary attendant just to let us have another look at Chris's head, because in my experience sometimes bruising can come out more and be more distinctive after a few days have passed.
And then he lowered himself so that he was looking at Christopher sideways, almost face to face. A pretty horrible thing to do, unless you are that detective who is looking for the opportunity to find that person's killers. And in this instance, Colin got his moment of inspiration.
And it became obvious what this mark was. It wasn't from the sole of a trainer, it was from the instep. It was the mark of where the laces had been intercrossed across the instep of the shoe. And of course that tied in perfectly with one of the witnesses who described seeing somebody kick Christopher, quote, like a penalty kick, like they were taking a penalty. And of course it makes much more sense that if he's lying on the floor, then a kick like that would be easily land on the scalp, on the top of his head. The difficulty with it was that, of course, the way that your trainers are laced up can vary each time and depends on whether there's a foot in there or not, or what thickness of socks you're wearing. It wasn't possible conclusively to compare the mark on Christopher's head with any one of the shoes we had.
It was then imperative that we identified the items of clothing.
One of the features of this investigation was just the sheer amount of information we were getting from the public. The public around here, on the nearby estate, they wanted to help us. And one of those snippets of information was that 2 of the suspects had gone, before they went to the party, by train to Clapham Junction to score some drugs. So we came here to Stoneleigh railway station, had a look through the CCTV, and we had the 2 of them going out towards Clapham Junction, then coming back later, just before the party. Crucially, they were wearing the same clothes, same colour, same design, as described by the witnesses up at the scene. So that CCTV was added to the material we were getting to try and work out who was who. So by working back from the time that we thought the assailant group had gone to the party, we just kept going backwards and backwards and backwards on the CCTV, and eventually we find them all together in a group walking towards the party. One of the most important things was trying to work out who did what. And we had all these eyewitness accounts describing clothing and sometimes hair colour, and saying this person wearing these clothes and with this colour hair punched somebody, or this person kicked somebody. But of course none of the witnesses knew the identity of who that person was.
We trawled the local CCTV, which gave us images both in black and white and also in colour. And in particular, one of the assailants was wearing a hooped top, which the definition in black and white was different to the picture that you got in colour. So it clearly showed an additional line on that polo shirt, which a colour one did not pick up as clearly.
And we're able to really work out exactly what everybody was wearing, because they were all different. They you know, people who had the similar colour shirts on had different coloured trousers or something like that, so they were all quite distinctive.
So we then were in the position where once we'd got all this information together, we were then able to execute further warrants on the people that we wanted to arrest in relation to this, and looking for specific items of clothing. And fortunately for us, those items of clothing had not been disposed of.
When we had the CCTV evidence, they were rearrested, and they started talking to us to a degree, but each of them was doing that. Yes, I was there, but I wasn't involved. I didn't throw any punches, I didn't throw any kicks. What we had was like a matrix, like a spreadsheet of all the witnesses across the top, and then down this side, the clothing they'd seen and what they saw that person wearing that clothing doing. And so they'd say, pink shirt, punched somebody, blue hoop shirt, kicked somebody, plain blue shirt, kicked and punched somebody.
We also had the situation where we had some accounts being given in relation to certainly one of the offenders wearing somebody else's top, but that simply could not have been the case because of the descriptions that we got. And subsequently, we also got blood from Chris's brother on a jacket which belonged to that assailant.
But the problem that I foresaw was that trying to express that to a jury in terms of just giving them a spreadsheet with X's and ticks in it and things was just going to be dry, and it was going to be difficult to convince them. And we first had to be sure ourselves that we knew who was wearing what and what they did.
The issues we had were that this had happened late at night under sodium street lighting, so therefore that in itself created some ambiguities in respect of light tops. Some people were describing a cream top and some people were describing a white top. It's obviously dependent on where they observed it from in relation to the street lighting.
And I was sitting down with Jack and we just talking it over like you do sometimes as to how we do it. And Jack made this throwaway comment, but he said, what we tried to do here is dress 5 tailors' dummies.
It became obvious that the best way to do this was to obtain some mannequins, dress them in the clothing that we had, and take them back to all the various scenes of the CCTV, together with the scene on the night. I discussed this with Colin. We looked at it, we thought about it, and Colin was in agreement that this was the best way forward. It would give us a good visual image that we could use at court, that could be shown to the defence, and would clearly discount some of the minor ambiguities we had in witness statements.
So what we did was we went to a local well-known store in Epsom, and they lent us 6 of their best brand new mannequins. We then got the clothing that we'd seized from the suspects, and we dressed each of the mannequins in what we believed from the witnesses the suspects were wearing on that night.
We didn't want to take anything for granted. So although it was in September as against the incident that happened in May, we chose to make sure that we had the right weather, we had the same phase of the moon. We closed the Yule bypass and used the hydraulic equipment that the fire brigade had so that we were able to video both from the ground and from the air. And at the same time, we then used video in evidence from each of the witnesses' windows that they had viewed the scene from to show that they had clear, uninterrupted view of what they had described they'd seen.
This garage had, at the time, had a CCTV camera just above where the cash machine is over there. It may still be there, or another one will still be there. And it pointed out directly across the forecourt and effectively just across the road here. And what we've then got is the group that ended up as the assailants are walking towards the party on that side of the road, in that direction there. And so we had that CCTV still. We brought the mannequins with their clothes on, and we put the mannequins over there and posed them in exactly the same position as the CCTV still, had a still photograph taken, and that gave us the two things for the jury to compare. Likewise, up in the shops up nearer where the party was, there was a Threshers Off licence, and that's where the assailant group had gone in to buy their drink before they went to the party. And again, there was good CCTV there because it was indoors and it was well lit and it was in colour. And again, we went back there with the mannequins and posed the mannequins in exactly the same position. We could literally have the still from the CCTV in one hand and pose the mannequins so that they were in exactly the same position. And by doing it at night and under similar lighting conditions, it came out as something that could be compared quite easily. And what we did was we had a police photographer take still photographs of the mannequins with the clothing on before we started, and we labelled them and said that these are clothes taken from each of the defendants, put their names in. But then after that, what we did was took further stills from the same CCTV cameras. So we were trying to recreate the conditions as best we could, so the photographs were all taken in exactly similar conditions. And it worked. We didn't do this exercise with the mannequins before we'd sent all the clothing away to be examined, because obviously it's more important to preserve any fibres or blood or any other evidence that might be on these clothes. And the only thing that came up was that there was a black jacket which actually belonged to one young man, but he lent it to another young man who was wearing it at the time, and they admitted this. And there was a speck of blood on the sleeve. And the lad that was wearing the jacket admitted that he'd punched somebody, but he said he punched Philip, Chris's brother, during the sort of melee. He hadn't, he said, punched Christopher, the man who died.
He'd admitted to assaulting Chris's brother because he felt that would put him away from the assault on Chris, but clearly by doing that, it showed he was wearing the jacket, which was then being described by numerous members of the public, and he was therefore at the scene involved in the assault on Chris.
They then said to us, if I arrest everybody in the gang, we could lose the case. Let's just concentrate on the three boys that killed Chris and what the witnesses saw.
We went to a conference with the QC that was going to be presenting the case, and he was of the view that the speck of blood on the sleeve of the jacket, because it related to the brother of the victim, not the victim, that we shouldn't proceed against that individual. And Jack was a little bit exercised and excited by this, and he bubbled up and was making this sort of impassioned plea to the lawyer and saying, no, we've got them. And it was all very dramatic in some ways. And then Jack sort of subsided, and I took the more considered view, and I just tried to go through it logically to the lawyer and said, look, we can prove he was there, we can prove that blood means he punched somebody. It's a joint enterprise in a fight. He punches somebody, somebody dies, even if it's somebody else, he's still a murderer. And as the best lawyers do, he saw my argument straight away and said, yep, OK, I'm with you, Mr. Sutton, we'll leave him in.
We went to court a year later. So witness protection, when Colin's there, liaison officers and Jack Regan's there, everybody's there. And again, he's helping us through the situation. And as we walked in, sitting with their parents in front of us, where the boys were there, who murdered Chris, in this foyer, sitting right opposite us. We had a friend from our church and one of the policemen, one of the team holding us and went, don't move, because he knew what we were thinking. You just want to go up and smack him, to be honest.
The oldest hadn't really come into much contact with the police. He had obviously had a difficult upbringing. He lived with his mother and his siblings. His mother tried his best. In relation to the 16-year-old, he was someone who had started recently coming into contact with the police. Certainly he came from a good home. His parents cared for him. They were concerned about him. It seemed almost at that time it wasn't possible to divert him away from the group that he was getting himself involved with. And the story they had given was that they had gone to purchase some cannabis, but in fact what came out in the trial was they'd actually gone to Clapham Junction to purchase crack cocaine. So certainly both of them that night had taken crack cocaine. They'd also drunk alcohol, which is probably a good reason as to how this situation arose.
It was a stupid fight, wasn't it? Well, it wasn't a fight, it was an attack. A fight is two people fight, this was an attack. Shouldn't have been happened.
Yeah.
It was just a
senseless
murder.
The trial was at the Old Bailey, and it was in March or April 2002, so it was about sort of 10 months afterwards. The judge had an application from the youngest of the suspects, of the defendants, saying that because he was so young, could he be allowed to sit in the well of the court rather than in the dock, so that he could have access to his lawyer at all times and understand the nature of proceedings. And we thought this was probably just a ruse to try to separate him from the older men who were in the dock.
The youngest, who was 15, he persisted throughout the interview in saying that he was not wearing his jacket, which was the jacket which had the forensic evidence on it. He insisted that he was wearing another member of the group's jacket. That simply couldn't have been the case.
So throughout the trial, the defendants were kind of saying it was nothing to do with them individually, and while they weren't exactly pointing the fingers at their friends, that was kind of in the background. They were sort of saying, well, yeah, I was there, I didn't do anything, it was other people. It didn't matter, ultimately. It was a joint enterprise.
None of them accepted responsibility in relation to this, which is why we had a full trial, as they each of them blamed each other and merely said they were present.
It was tough to sit and look at the boys who killed your son and them lie for 6 weeks and lie, and you've got to sit there and just take that and say nothing.
The jury couldn't make their mind up at the end of the case. It was a Friday, we were all sent away for the weekend, came back Monday. They still couldn't make their mind up by lunchtime, and the judge just gave them, I don't know, they mumble in court, you can't hear a lot. And I think he said I'd give 10 to 2 or something. Went outside, I said, shall we go and get a cup of tea, Colin? No, he said, they'll be back in 10 minutes, and it'd be a guilty verdict.
No one was ever able to say who delivered the fatal kick, but there was a cutthroat defence with people blaming each other. 3 of the suspects were convicted of murder on the grounds of joint enterprise and went to prison for a very long time.
They were all convicted duly of murder. I think the judge in sentencing them, certainly the youngest of the defendants, was given a recommendation of only 6 years for his life sentence. I think the part he played and the minor role he played in it was reflected in the amount of the recommendation given by the judge.
The sentence they got was, the 15-year-old, he was 16, and he got life imprisonment, 6 years. The 16-year-old who was 17 in court got life imprisonment 9 years, and the 19-year-old got life imprisonment 10 years.
No doubt that those thugs probably never intended to take his life, but their errant actions, their thuggery and bullying, really, because there were more of them as well, ended up taking Christopher's life.
I think undoubtedly, on reflection, the combination of alcohol and drugs was probably the reason for this, because none of them had a history of violence as such and previously been involved in this type of incident.
It really underlined the tragedy of this whole case, that it wasn't just one young life, Christopher Donovan, who was killed, but 3 more young lives were touched by having a conviction for murder, and it was all just such a senseless tragedy that it happened in the first place.
When you reflect on it, nobody wins. We have a family that lost a son. We have 3 young men who blighted possibly the rest of their lives and certainly have spent a period of time in custody as a result of their actions. There's a lot of other people that have been touched by this. There were members of the public who woke up or looked out their windows to see what happened. There was the poor lady who was driving the car that struck Chris.
In court, I said to Vi, look at the families. Take one look at them. There's no winners. We've all lost a kid today. Ryan Seymour's dad came up, and we were crying. We were crying. It was so emotional. We didn't cheer, did we? Like I said to Vi, no one's won here. We've all lost a kid. We were crying. And this father walked up, went like this, and he went, I'm sorry. And I just went over and we hugged each other. I think me and him at the first restorative justice meeting in this country went murder. And we talked, and I said to him, don't worry, no one's going to come after your boy in prison. He knew we'd do prison work, yeah? I said, no one's going to come after your boy in prison. I just got what I wanted today, justice. That's all I wanted. And Colin said afterwards, I've never seen such compassion in all my life between 2 fathers. Coming home that night in the car, I turned to Vi and said, you know what? We need to forgive the boys that did this.
I didn't want to forgive them. I didn't want to. But what I did realise was that actually, if you hold on to unforgiveness, it will just destroy you. It won't destroy them, because they won't care. They won't know. So I realised probably later on that it's about, not about how you feel, it's just doing it. It's a choice. You just do it and you keep doing it. And even today, all these years later, we're still doing that.
Christopher's family went on to use his death to try and improve the lot of prisoners and try and make the world a better place, to try and make something positive come out of the negative, which is a remarkable thing to do.
The remarkable thing about the Donovan family, Ray and Vi Donovan, how they reacted to their son's death, is that they're both committed Christians, and I think they've looked at the tragedy, looked at the terrible situation they're in, and thought, how can we make the best of this? How can we turn this into a force for good? And with the Christopher Donovan Trust, that's what they've done. They go around to prisons, they go around to schools, they talk about restorative justice, they talk to people, to young people, about their lives and how they shouldn't waste them. And I've met people, young men, that they've spoken to who told me, if it weren't for Ray and Vi Donovan and their work, I'd either be in prison or I'd be dead. They really have made a force for good out of the tragedy that was the murder of their son.
The most important thing for us was that we felt that we had done the best job we could with the resources and the information we had, and that we were able to, as best we could, to show to Ray and Vi exactly what had happened on that night and how Chris had died.
I think the fact that he allowed us to be kept in the loop on everything as much as he could was really helpful to us. You don't really realise, when you look back, you realise how helpful that was. that we knew what was going on, that they actually were doing this, doing that, and it was so important to us. It was the one thing we had to hold on to, knowing that we would eventually get some justice for Chris.
Wherever we go around the country or around the world, wherever we go, he's our story.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have got justice, I know that.
To put your whole life and your trust in that one person is quite something when everything's out of control, I can tell you. To know that they've got your back.
He really cared. He wasn't a policeman, this is my job. He was a man who cares about the people he's working for. It's an unusual gift, isn't it?
It is a wonderful gift, isn't it? We don't know how grateful and lucky we really, really are to have him, you know, and goodness knows how many people he's treated like that.
He's always there, isn't he?
Absolutely. I think he'll always be there. He's part of our life.